And next slide, please. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today. We will hear from 3 of our esteemed precision development colleagues who are leading our climate initiatives. Our CEO, Owen Barder, will kick things off to introduce precision development's take on the needs and opportunities for creating climate solutions. Tomoko Harigaya, Chief Economist and Director of Research, will speak on adaptation themes, referencing evidence on promising innovations, including forecasts. Yifan Powers, Senior Research Manager, will speak on mitigation themes with reference to evidence-based opportunities that emphasize additional co-benefits. And then Owen will close with some thoughts on how we can work together to make markets and investments work for smallholder farmers. We'll then have some time for Q&A, where I'll post some of the questions to our panelists that the participants have shared in the Q&A box. So please enjoy our event, and over to Owen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Caitlin. I'm going to kick off with a reminder about some key numbers about climate change and smallholder farmers to get us all on the same page. First, on adaptation, we all know that climate change is causing damage everywhere, and the effects are especially significant in low-income countries. About 3/4 of the people living in extreme poverty are smallholder farmers, and a 1-degree increase in global temperatures, which is now inevitable, is estimated to reduce crop yields by around 4.5%. And of course, for some farmers, the impact will be far worse than this average. Extreme weather events are causing significant losses, and in low-income countries, people may not have resilience mechanisms to cope with those. Climate change reduces incomes, worsens food security, worsens nutrition. It represents a major obstacle to economic development. So as I think everyone recognizes, climate change has the largest impact on people with low incomes, and those people with the greatest need for adaptation are people who've contributed least to the problem. People in extreme poverty, most of whom are smallholder farmers, are right in the front line of this. Second, on mitigation, the data are not very good. Agriculture and land use change globally account for about 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that 20% might well rise in the coming years if other sectors continue to reduce their carbon intensity faster than agriculture is. Of these emissions, more than half are low-income countries, and over 30% are from smallholder farms. So smallholder farms currently account for about 5% of total greenhouse gas emissions. That's, to put it in perspective, roughly twice the total emissions from the aviation sector globally, or about half the total emissions of the United States. So while people in low-income countries are absolutely not the cause of climate change, if you look at historical emissions, there are opportunities for reductions in emissions from smallholder agriculture and land use change to make a meaningful contribution to global mitigation efforts. Furthermore, there's a growing range of exciting new approaches to carbon dioxide removals, that is, taking carbon from the atmosphere, which could be done more cheaply and at greater scale across low-income countries, including on smallholder farms, and we'll be talking about some of those today. Carbon removals are going to be essential if we're going to reach net zero globally, because there's going to be some residual emissions that we can't practically avoid. On current estimates, we're going to need at least 10 gigatons a year of carbon removals by 2050. Now, agricultural land could potentially contribute up to 5 gigatons a year through conventional soil carbon sequestering practices, and perhaps at 25 gigatons a year if frontier technologies like enhanced rock weathering prove viable. The crucial point is that if we invest now in agriculture in low-income countries, could my notes disappeared. Agricultural land, we could, if we invest now, agriculture in low-income countries could contribute a significant portion of those removals needed to reach net zero. For example, tropical landscapes make up about 1/3 of the agricultural area where soil carbon sequestering and enhanced rock weathering can be applied. We can have the next slide, please. So this slide summarizes relationships which are well known to many of you. The relationship between adaptation and development, I think, is pretty well known. Adaptation is a necessary condition for sustainable prosperity, and sustainable prosperity is also necessary for adaptation. And Tomoko will be talking shortly about opportunities in that area. The relationship between mitigation and development is a bit more nuanced. As we'll be setting out today, our view is that these are also deeply connected. Of course, unless we find a way to limit climate change, there's no hope of long-term development. Mitigation is a necessary condition for sustainable prosperity. But not all the steps to mitigate climate change will accelerate development. For example, if countries no longer have access to cheap energy, that could slow down their economic development. But as Yifan will be setting out, there are huge opportunities for mitigation which can increase agricultural yields and incomes and resilience in the short run. Even in agriculture, not all mitigation measures will directly increase incomes in the short run. But if payments for mitigation are available, for example, from carbon markets, this could represent a big source of income for low-income countries, including for smallholder farmers. So the key takeaway here is that tackling climate change and accelerating development depend on each other. We can't reach our climate change goals without investment in agriculture, and we can't succeed in agriculture without investing in the global south. And to make meaningful and sustainable changes, we have to center our approach around the realities of the farmers and their families, including the hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers who make up the majority of people living in poverty. Smallholder farmers have agency, and we're only going to succeed in our climate agenda if we act in true partnership with them and work with them to design approaches that meet their needs. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, that partnership centered on the reality of farmers in the global south is what Precision of Development aims to do. We're a global nonprofit with a vision to end information poverty, and we provide cost-effective, customized, scalable solutions to farmers in the global south. We do this by working at the intersection of technology, data science, and behavioral science to empower people living in poverty to improve their livelihoods, mitigate risks, and advance environmental sustainability. We've built services that reach around 10 million people in low-income countries. So that's our approach to thinking about climate solutions for smallholder farmers. And I'm going to hand over now to Tomoko Harigaya, PxD's Chief Economist and Director of Research, to talk about some high potential interventions in climate adaptation. Tomoko.
Thanks, Owen. Next slide, please. Right. So I wanted to start by briefly laying out both short-term and long-term challenges that climate change brings to smallholder agriculture. So first, extreme weather events urgently create the need for farmers to adapt to their agricultural practices in the short term, but also the average weather patterns are changing over time, and this will continue to affect the yield potential of crops being cultivated and the optimal management practices. For example, if monsoons are coming later or temperatures are increasing in the summer, that might mean that farmers have a shorter cropping season and need to grow different crops or different varieties of the same crop. And in some geographies, this could also affect the suitability of the land for agricultural production in general. And in some of these cases, the optimal economic decision for farmers may be to just get out of agriculture. And these problems are, of course, heterogeneous and dynamic, which means that we need to continue innovating, testing, and optimizing solutions to these problems that will continue changing. One of our PxD's core services has been providing digital agricultural advisory services to smallholder farmers. And many of these PxD's recommendations, which we often develop with the government partners, are actually already about climate-related management practices. So for example, the two-way SMS advisory service we developed in Kenya started in response to the fall armyworm outbreak a few years ago. We also regularly provide advice on planting across geographies based on the timing of monsoon onset and update our advice in real time based on climate information we have. With that as a background, in the next few slides, I'll share 3 exciting opportunities we've identified beyond digital agriculture that leverage innovations in agricultural sciences, financial products, and in information technologies. Next slide, please. The first example is an agricultural science innovation. there are large investments being made to produce improved seed varieties, and especially the varieties that have a better chance of surviving under extreme weather conditions. And this example on the slide is a flood-tolerant rice variety called Swarna Sub-1, which was developed by ERI for rice cultivation in the eastern coastal region of India. And this variety does substantially better when crops are submerged underwater, as you can see on the slide in the top bar. An agronomic trial shows an average of 45% yield increase during the flood year in Orissa in India. But also importantly, it does not compromise yield when there is no flood, and that makes it attractive for farmers. So in fact, when farmers are given free seed samples to experiment with the Swarna Sub-1 in a randomized evaluation, researchers found that the large proportion of farmers who had access to these seed samples continued to use the Swarna Sub-1 variety in the following season, and saw a 10% increase in yield, even though there was no flood that year. And that increase in yield is coming from farmers increasing investments in other inputs like fertilizer. And the intuition here is that when farmers are making agricultural decisions, they may not be maximizing yield or even profits, but rather thinking about how to manage their risks, because big losses can be so consequential for the household. And once they have a tool to mitigate those big climate risks, it increases the returns to investing in their farms, and that creates the incentives for farmers to invest more, leading to higher productivity. And that can increase farmer income not only during climate shocks, but also when there's no shock. And building on that evidence, PxD is now collaborating with the government of West Bengal to start scaling the distribution of these free seed samples. And we are also interested in identifying other varieties of climate resilient seeds that could generate similar, sustained effects on productivity and resilience. Next slide, please. So that was an example of an opportunity to expand the direct access to climate adaptation inputs. But some of these adaptation technologies are costly, and that can be a difficult barrier for farmers to overcome. So the next example is an innovation that lowers the cost and the risk of investing in climate adaptation technology. This is in central Kenya, where lack of water during the dry season is a very big challenge for dairy farmers. An average household there spends roughly 3 to 4 hours per week fetching water, and that's usually women's job. Water storage tanks like the one you see on the slide are widely available, but too expensive for most farmers to purchase without a loan. So PxD is working with 2 dairy cooperatives in the Rift Valley region and the Development Innovation Lab at the University of Chicago to design and scale an innovative loan product that reduces the requirements and the risk of borrowing to help farmers purchase these water tanks. And when we first actually started working in this area, we went in trying to understand what types of agricultural information we could provide over mobile phones to help farmers increase their production. But when we started asking farmers about their challenges, many of them talked about insufficient water during the dry season. And that's not a problem we can solve with digital advice. So we changed our approach and introduced to the dairies this particular loan product for water tanks that had strong impact evidence from a randomized evaluation in a different region of Kenya. And you can see the summary of the impact on the slide. These loans were shown to increase water tank ownership by 46%, increase the dairy milk income by 20 to 25%, and strikingly address the last mile problem in girls' schooling as well. Just to note, the enrollment rate was already high at baseline at 97 to 98%, so improved access to water tanks helped to close that last mile gap. And currently, the 2 cooperatives we are working with have started rolling out these loans, but we've already actually heard from some other co-ops and dairies that are interested in learning from our experience and offering similar types of loans. So now we are working to figure out how we can mobilize resources to help a larger number of cooperatives explore these types of new loan designs to find what works for their members. Next slide, please. So the last example is an innovation that leverages advances in information technologies. Weather information has been consistently one of the most frequently requested information from users of PxD's digital advisory services. And external evidence here is also very strong. So 2 randomized control trials from different continents suggest that economic returns to having access to accurate forecasts can be somewhere around $100 to $280 per farmer per year. And these impacts seem to be coming from reduced labor costs because farmers can plan activities more efficiently, and increased yields because farmers are likely optimizing the timing of agricultural practices. And I just wanted to share one anecdote from PxD's experience in Pakistan to complement these impact figures. So last year, you might remember that there were floods during the harvest time in South Asia. And we didn't have forecasts for floods, but we had forecasts for heavy rain, which we sent to farmers in Pakistan. And after the season, there were farmers who told us, I harvested my crops earlier before the rain came because of the forecast you sent me, and I was able to save my harvest. So this type of real-time climate information can be really valuable for farmers. And as you see on the slide, there are different types of forecasts that farmers can use for different agricultural decisions. Next slide, please. But despite this potential very large impact, and despite the fact that the technology to generate these local forecasts exists, most smallholder farmers actually don't have access to these local accurate forecasts. And just to illustrate, a couple of days ago, we looked up forecasts online for today in one county in western Kenya. So there's a Busia town, and then there's Butula, which is a village roughly 40 kilometers away from Busia. And what you see are identical hourly precipitation forecasts between the 2 locations. And that's likely because the resolution of forecasts in rural Kenya is very low. So, forecast for Butula just pulls information from Busia town. And there are a few reasons for the limited availability of hyperlocal forecasts in smallholder geographies. And first, we know local weather stations are sparse in the global south. Second, the global public sector, like international research institutes, that has the skills to produce these forecasts, doesn't have the mandate or the funding to reach smallholder populations. And then third, the private sector largely hasn't served smallholder farmers because it's not profitable. And part of the challenge, at least historically, has been that producing high-quality forecasts has a large fixed cost. But once forecasts are produced, they can be easily shared among many people at little cost. So this makes forecasts a difficult commodity to monetize. And the global South governments haven't been able to fill that gap, primarily because they have limited resources and capacity. But also, meteorology is one of these areas where there hasn't been a culture of collaboration between governments, especially the global South governments and global institutions. Next slide, please. So PxD has been working with farmers and partners to address these challenges. And in this area, we see our role as a bridge across stakeholders, for example, to line up resources needed or identify high-quality forecast providers for a specific geography. And we do this by consulting external meteorology experts. We also gather feedback from farmers on what they need and then channel that back to the forecast providers so that we have not just the high quality, but locally relevant forecasts that farmers can easily use for agricultural decisions. So far, we've partnered with the Coffee Board of India, the Government of Punjab in Pakistan, and Climate Forecast Applications Network, or Yifan, to deliver short and medium-range forecasts. And you can see an example message that goes out to coffee farmers in Karnataka on the slide. And these are daily probabilistic rainfall forecasts for the next 7 days, because farmers there told us that they wanted forecasts at least several days in advance to have enough time to arrange labor for their activities. And we've gone through quite a few iterations with farmers to settle on this particular set of information. And we continue to iterate on things like audio messages and effective bundling of forecasts and actionable advice. And we've also gotten very positive reactions from farmers, and we are looking forward to expanding these types of partnerships to develop additional types of forecasts for smallholder farmers in more geographies. Right. So this was a very brief overview of PxD's adaptation work, but for now, I will hand over to Yifan Powers, Senior Research Manager, to talk about our mitigation work.
Thanks, Tomoko. I'm very pleased to be able to share with you today some of the evidence-backed opportunities for smallholder farmers to engage in climate change mitigation, which PxD has been working on. Next slide, please. So, as Owen emphasized at the top, smallholder farmers are not responsible for the climate crisis, but neither are they passive victims without agency to create a more sustainable agricultural future for themselves. So last year, Precision Development partnered with the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, which is a scientific leader in the climate change space, to explore some of the evidence-backed mitigation opportunities which could be implemented by smallholder farmers. And we were particularly interested in identifying opportunities which could provide farmers with some private benefits as well. For example, through increased soil fertility or payments for their environmental services, because transitioning to low carbon agricultural practices is not necessarily without cost for farmers, and there has to be an incentive and catalyzing ecosystem for them to do so. Some of the examples of the opportunities we identified for implementation at the farm level are illustrated on this slide, and these include carbon dioxide sequestration in plant soil systems through practices like agroforestry, reducing nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer use through precision nutrient management, and reducing methane emissions from livestock, primarily from ruminants like dairy cows, as well as rice cultivation. And for us, the exciting aspect about all these opportunities is that they do come with some potential important co-benefits for farmers. For example, potential input cost savings in the case of fertilizer management, or payments for carbon sequestration from carbon credit projects. And they also can provide some key environmental co-benefits like increased biodiversity. So from PxD's perspective, these co-benefits are really critical aspects of mitigation opportunities, especially when it comes to credible programming with respect to farmer adoption of practices and behavior change, as well as creating equitable and just mitigation programs. The last thing I want to mention here is that outcome measurement, both in terms of climate outcomes like carbon accounting, as well as social and environmental outcomes, is a challenge overall for the sector, but especially in the smallholder farmer context. Just as an example, really credible measurement, for example, for soil organic carbon sequestration, requires gathering soil samples from each field and then conducting lab analyses on those samples. So this is obviously not cost-effective nor scalable, nor realistic to implement in the types of rural communities that smallholder farmers are in. So monitoring, measurement, reporting, verification of results is a key issue when thinking about mitigation in agriculture, and it's especially pertinent when it comes to payments for environmental services through voluntary carbon markets, which Owen will speak more to later in the presentation. Next slide, please. But when it comes to designing mitigation programs, which have clear theories of change for why and how farmers transition to new practices, we do know what works, and that's to center these programs around the realities of smallholder farmers. This is important not just for farmers' private benefits, but also for climate outcomes, as the exact agricultural practices to achieve reductions or removals in emissions can vary substantially across farming contexts. For example, a tree species or a seedling distribution program, which works well for agroforestry in East Africa, may not be appropriate for a farming community in southern India. Farmers are individuals, and their ability and willingness to invest in new technologies, perhaps to take bigger risks, can be quite different on top of their varying pre-existing agroecological conditions. So just some examples of things that it will be important to think through when designing scientifically sound and evidence-based mitigation programs include the farming system that a smallholder is in, for example, what kind of crops they're growing and whether it's irrigated or rain-fed agriculture, their specific incentives for adopting the technology, for example, whether or not there are some cost savings involved, their information ecosystem, whether or not they're aware of the practice, and also what their priors might be about this particular practice. Accessibility, so whether or not they have access to the necessary inputs, if there's a market for that input. The cost of adoption, not just in terms of monetary cost, but also in terms of labor and time. And lastly, measurement. What do we know about how we can measure outcomes for this technology, and how credible do we find this measurement? Next slide, please. So what I'd like to talk through now is an example emissions reduction project focused on nitrous oxide emissions, which PxD ran in 2022 in Gujarat, India. Emissions of nitrous oxide from human activities are largely driven by inefficient nitrogen fertilizer use in agriculture. And this is particularly true in South Asian geographies, where there are sometimes subsidy environments which can distort fertilizer behavior. One evidence-based approach to improve fertilizer management is site-specific nutrient management, operationalized through decision support tools for nutrient management like leaf color charts, which is what's pictured on this slide. There is a substantial evidence base on how decision support tools like leaf color charts can reduce nitrous oxide emissions in cases of fertilizer overuse, as well as improve farmer outcomes like crop yields. And there's almost no existing study which shows a negative impact on yields compared to the farmer's baseline fertilizer practice or even blanket fertilizer recommendations. And leaf color charts are particularly attractive for use in smallholder farming contexts, as it is low cost and provides rule of thumb recommendations, which requires limited background knowledge of scientific processes to understand and implement. As you can see from the slide, the leaf color chart is just a plastic ruler-shaped strip containing several panels in a range of green, which farmers can use to compare against their crop leaf. Depending on where their crop leaf falls, they will either add fertilizer or not. So I'll just share a short testimonial from a farmer we worked with in India who used the leaf color chart. I received leaf color chart from my village's agro dealer. He trained me on how to use it. Earlier, I used to apply up to 10 kilograms of urea per hectare, but after using leaf color chart, I applied 5 kilograms per hectare. This helped me save 2,000 INR on urea and another 2,000 INR on labor cost. I still have the leaf color chart and will use it next year. Next slide, please. So this leaf color chart project that PxD ran was focused on testing different distribution pathways, as well as leaf color chart product designs to understand how to increase its availability and usage, as the distribution of physical LCCs into farmers' hands remains a challenge to widespread scale. We also, however, gathered some suggestive evidence on the effect of leaf color chart distribution on farmer fertilizer behavior changes, as well as changes in greenhouse gas emissions. What we found was really promising. We found wide use of the tool, as more than half of the cotton farmers who received a leaf color chart reported using it, and overall fertilizer use fell by more than a third, suggesting that farmers who use leaf color charts reduce their fertilizer use by more than 60%, assuming that this effect largely comes from leaf color chart adopters. And for farmers who received leaf color charts on average, this decrease in fertilizer usage resulted in a decrease of greenhouse gas emissions by 0.3 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare. Like I mentioned, these are very promising results, and PxD is very excited to take this work forward. But I do want to caveat, however, with respect to emissions estimates, that we calculated this number using a tier 2 approach called the Cool Farm tool. And by nature of tier 2 emissions estimates, these come with a certain amount of uncertainty, as they use general emissions factors and other generalized assumptions about greenhouse gas fluxes. Next slide, please. What Precision Development would like to do now is work on 3 key aspects of leaf color charts. Currently, we're focused on scaling leaf color charts, and especially in India, in the cotton sector, with generous support from the Apparel Impact Institute to help create a more sustainable textile industry. And in building these scaling models, we are collaborating with partners who can leverage their existing extension infrastructure to deploy these charts at scale and train farmers to use them effectively. For example, state governments. Precision Development is providing the technical assistance to our scaling partners in planning the distribution of the leaf color chart program, developing robust monitoring systems, and managing logistical challenges. The second aspect we want to explore is contributing to the sparse literature on leaf color chart impacts on farmer fertilizer behavior, as well as ultimate impacts on greenhouse gas emissions at the farm level. While we were able, like I mentioned, to generate suggestive insights on these outcomes in our pilot, given the promising results, we would like to conduct a larger scale rigorous evaluation to precisely estimate the impact and cost effectiveness of leaf color chart delivery interventions on climate and farmer outcomes, and potentially use some tier 3 approaches to estimate the emissions changes. Lastly, given Precision Development's expertise in digitally based interventions with smallholder farmers, we would like to explore whether we can develop an as easy to use digital precision nutrient management tool that an implementer might be able to disseminate at really negligible costs. So we're please do get in touch if you're interested in learning about or collaborating with us in any of these aspects. For now, I'll hand it back to Owen, who will share some insights on how to generate financing for the kinds of climate adaptation and mitigation innovations, which Tomoko and I have just shared.
Thanks, Yifan. Have the next slide, please. I'm going to talk very briefly about what might need to happen to accelerate programs in smallholder farms that would achieve both climate and development objectives. Now, one promising source of funding for projects to support climate mitigation is obviously carbon markets. Voluntary carbon markets, now roughly $2 billion a year, are expected to rise to $50 billion by 2030, although it remains to be seen whether that will actually happen without some significant improvements in the way these markets work. At the moment, as the slide shows, very few projects are being financed in sustainable agriculture, and of those, very few are in the global south outside China. As carbon markets grow, they could funnel financing towards mitigation effects in the global south, including nature-based solutions leveraging agriculture. But for this to happen, we're going to have to think about some innovative finance mechanisms to make these projects investable. Next slide, please. So I'm going to use a specific example to illustrate this, but with some generalizable lessons. We've mentioned the possibility of enhanced rock weathering as a potential mechanism for carbon removals. Now, the science here is not fully baked yet, and I don't want to get ahead of what we really know, but the idea is that if you spread ground up basalt rock across agricultural land, it reacts with the carbon in the atmosphere to form a stable carbonate, which is then washed into the water system and ultimately safely into the sea, where it remains for thousands of years. So it permanently removes carbon from the atmosphere. So this is a frontier technology. It's promising, but there's still a lot of work to do on the science. If it does pan out, then it's extremely likely that this is a technology in which low-income countries, particularly in places that are hot and where there is a lot of rainfall, will have a significant comparative advantage. So this is a huge economic opportunity for the global south to provide low-cost carbon removal cost-effectively for the entire world. And with carbon markets, they could earn significant revenues doing that, large enough to be macroeconomically significant for low-income countries and to make a big difference to the lives of people living in poverty. Next slide, please. Now, unfortunately, almost none of the research into this approach is being conducted in, for, or by countries in the global south. There are a small number of trial programs, for example, in India and Kenya, but a lot of the energy and activity is in high-income countries. Now, we should think about why that is and what we can do to make sure that low-income countries can also take advantage of this opportunity. There is an organization working on how this approach might apply in India. It requires significant research and development to test different approaches, different types of rock, soil types, to see what works. But who's going to pay for that R&D? It's quite hard to invest in this as a private investor, because the firm that does the R&D can't really create a competitive advantage unless they're able to use intellectual property rights to protect what they learn. But ideally, this knowledge should be a public good. If we work out that this is a successful way of removing carbon from the atmosphere, then we're going to want to apply it widely as soon as possible. Another company is doing research and developing a platform for the monitoring, reporting, and verification of these kinds of removals. And their business model is to create a proprietary platform that project implementers can use to be monitored and to produce verified reductions. And that proprietary platform is what's required by their private investors. But that means that they can't share what they've learned, and that makes it harder for the world to have open, shared, trusted verification mechanisms. So, I mean, the obvious point is that the knowledge generated by research and development in rock weathering and in the mechanisms for monitoring it, that knowledge is a public good. And like many public goods, it's not sufficiently funded. Now, you could tie this knowledge up in intellectual property, and that's probably what you have to do to attract private investment, but that comes at the expense of limiting the availability of the knowledge more widely. Furthermore, rock weathering programs involve significant setup costs. The rock needs to be mined and ground, transported, and then spread. Now, these costs are well worth bearing if there's going to be a significant market for carbon removals. But a projection from McKinsey about how large voluntary markets might be in 2030 is not really going to satisfy investors, especially if there's no agreement yet about how carbon removals are defined, how they're measured, how they're verified. We're going to need more predictable demand for carbon removals to make these projects investable. Now, if, as seems likely, this approach to carbon removals will be far more cost-effective in low-income countries, then we're also going to need to deal with the costs and risks created by the cross-border trade. For example, we're going to have to find ways to manage foreign exchange risk and the perception of risks from corruption or reputational risks. And then lastly, these programs have dual benefits, as we've been emphasizing. They remove carbon cost effectively, and in this case, they could provide big increases in revenue for low-income countries and for smallholder farmers. So ideally, they'd be funded from resources allocated to carbon removals and from resources allocated to global development and equitable growth. Each budget would get a far bigger bang for its buck if the other budget is co-invested. But there's no existing mechanism to combine funding from these two pools of resources, and neither pool of resources is willing or able to invest enough on its own. So that's the challenge, and that's a generalizable challenge to lots of these projects and programs that could support programs in low-income countries that would have both carbon and both climate and development benefits. Next slide, please. Now, there are possible solutions to this. I realize this is a busy slide with lots of text on it, but that's kind of the point. There's a whole alphabet soup of innovative financing mechanisms, some of which I've been involved with over the years. For example, advanced market commitments were developed from an insight by one of our founders, Nobel laureate Michael Kramer, to finance new vaccines. And indeed, AMCs were used recently to accelerate the production of COVID vaccines that benefited all of us. So what we need to do is match the financing problem to the appropriate instrument. So we were trying to stimulate more R&D and carbon projects in low-income countries. Some sort of pool finance mechanism, such as an advanced market commitment or maybe a prize, might be appropriate. Pool finance or performance-based finance could be used to reduce the demand risk that I was talking about. And it could also be used to break down the funding silos. You could also use straightforward concessional or blended finance mechanisms to deal with the cross-border risks. We're going to need some kind of trusted platform for trading verified carbon credits, and this is a public good. It's not completely clear to me that a platform financed by project developers can ever be sufficiently independent or transparent to be widely trusted. And we often recognize the need for public bodies to set and enforce standards across economic life, and I suspect this may turn out to be no exception. If so, then this probably needs a small amount of continuous public funding rather than innovative finance or catalytic investments. So in conclusion, there are huge opportunities for low-income countries to access carbon funding in ways which accelerate climate mitigation and global development. But those opportunities are not being developed fast enough for a variety of well-understood reasons. We have a toolkit of innovative finance mechanisms to unblock these and to get money channeled much faster and much more efficiently into getting these programs off the ground. And I think we're going to have to start using it. Next slide, please. So that's me on the innovative finance need. Bringing all the themes together, we've talked about the relationships between climate adaptation mitigation, and international development, we've talked about some hugely exciting opportunities and described some mechanisms we might need to unlock these. Above all, we believe that these climate programs need to be centered on the reality of smallholder farmers. And there are 4 threads that run through our thinking about how the climate ecosystem should evolve for smallholder farmers. First, we need to invest in knowledge and generate evidence and use that evidence for decisions and advice. A key priority is to get real-time information to people who need it. Second, we need to convene and collaborate among partners, governments, science, NGOs, project developers, and financiers. Third, we need to join up environmental and development objectives and budgets to unlock a whole range of cost-effective programs. And fourth, we have to understand and address a range of market failures and government failures that inhibit equitable progress, e.g. using innovative finance mechanisms. Next slide, please. So as we finish up, I'd like to say a big thanks to the many partners who've supported precision development over the years, including this work on climate, which we've summarized. We're really very grateful to you. And let's end up on what we can all do. I'd love to hear from you in the discussion, but some action points for us on this slide: join up climate and development, share knowledge and data openly, put in place mechanisms to finance and accelerate progress, and let us work together to build the market, not to build our market share. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Owen, and thank you to all of our panelists for that thoughtful commentary and for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. I'm going to start posing some questions to our panelists. Attendees, feel free to use the Q&A chat box for any questions or even just general comments that you'd like to leave for our team. So I wanted to start off with a question for Tomoko. You talked about how traditional thinking has assumed that smallholder farmers are always seeking to maximize yields and profits. And then you discussed some of the experimental insights that have shaped our understanding and how farmers in reality may be more concerned about managing risk and minimizing losses. So besides the example of stress-tolerant seeds that you mentioned, what are some other technologies or interventions that have promising evidence in supporting farmer decisions on risk management?
Thanks, Galen. Again, perhaps share a couple of examples. So for example, there's the agricultural index insurance. There's a study in Ghana that shows that when farmers have, or decide to take up agricultural insurance, they go out of their way to also increase their agricultural credit they take out and invest more. I think insurance has, its own challenges to really kind of increase the take-up among farmers. But when the insurance product is designed well and is able to, get farmers to take up, then that could really help farmers to increase their investments. And then another example would be pest alerts or blight alerts. I think this is for potato farmers in Bangladesh. There's some initial evidence that having accurate real-time alerts help farmers kind of protect their crops, and they also increase investments in things like fertilizer and increase their yield. So those are a couple other examples that I think this is there are these examples in different geographies, but I don't think we know kind of very well about what are the characteristics of interventions or specific risks that need to be protected, for farmers to kind of feel confident to increase their investment.
Great, thanks so much, Tomoko. We have a question from Ronali, thanking us for the session and asking, carbon emission estimates could be quite a helpful weapon for smallholder farmers. Is there a design framework or potentially mathematical model already developed to calculate emissions, and any public financing system already available in any of these countries? Perhaps Yifan, if you want to try to take on the question about the design frameworks, and then maybe Owen weigh in on the financing.
Sure, yeah, that's a really great question, as I think it gets to the heart a lot of how we make mitigation programming work, especially when connecting it with finance. So there are, generalized models to estimate emissions. So the IPCC, for example, I mentioned tiers, has 3 tiers of emissions estimation, starting from tier 1, which is the most general, where you're using default emissions factors. And then as you increase all the way to tier 3, you're really customizing more to information and data about your specific context. As it connects, though, to really credible carbon accounting, especially when it comes to using it in the voluntary carbon market and for offsets, there's a lot of debate about how credible different models are. And so this is a big area of innovation, especially in the agricultural space, to help develop methods for estimating emissions that are credible, but also scalable and cost effective. Because like I mentioned, the gold standard for a lot of these calculations requires a lot of intensive and costly in-person analysis. So I think that's an active area of innovation that we need to fund, because it is, from my personal perspective, a public good that we should all be able to leverage to catalyze, carbon removals through nature-based solutions, for example, in smallholder farming contexts. Owen, did you want to add anything more on the financing aspect?
Only really to say that I think the
Owen, I think you might have muted yourself.
I'm so sorry. I think it's carbon markets, both for the voluntary carbon markets and the compliance markets, both have huge opportunity, but have also been plagued with problems. And I think the world really needs to come together quite soon to figure out how to make these markets work well and what kind of market infrastructure is needed. It's no surprise that there's a bit of a sort of Wild West, and I think it's very hard for people on either side of the transaction to have confidence in the market, either for the buyer or the seller. So at the moment, there really isn't financing available for smallholder farmers in the global south to access carbon markets, or only very little and at very low rates. And it seems to me some investment in some of the things that we've talked about trusted verification mechanisms, but also addressing things like transactions costs, and could make a real difference to getting the money down to smallholder farmers. And I think that could really drive change. So it seems to me that a little bit of tweaking in the markets and some coming together on that could make a big difference to this kind of climate finance.
And then another follow-up question that we got from Tishom, also about the carbon markets, asking, there are cases where farmers are engaging in agroforestry practices and some environmentally friendly practices traditionally, yet struggling to win food insecurity. How can we make such smallholder farmers benefit from the carbon market? Owen or Yifan, do you want to take that one on?
Sure, that's another really great question. I'll attempt to answer it. I think there's 2 aspects to this. One is, again, emphasizing, like we did throughout our investigation, of potential mitigation opportunities for smallholder farmers, of the understanding of what the co-benefits are. So, and really having a focus on do no harm. So not asking farmers to do something which we know from the evidence might be deleterious to their agricultural productivity or impose onerous costs on them. And then the second part, I think, is really making sure that smallholder farmers are receiving a fair portion of any potential revenues from carbon markets. As it stands in the market right now, there's a range of revenue sharing models. And there's also kind of some structural issues with the market where it's very costly to develop these kind of projects. You have to originate a project, pay for verification, develop the program, actually implement it on the ground. And so we want to be really careful about understanding what the ultimate trickle down profit to farmers are, and also when they get paid. Like I mentioned, some of the practices, for example, for carbon sequestration might require some upfront investment from farmers. So that timing about payments, I think, is really critical. And I think the market is currently developing its framework about how to think about this. There are some pioneers who are, pushing forward really progressive revenue sharing models. And I think this is something that we also need to continue to think critically about as we funnel financing through carbon markets to hopefully reach smallholder farmers.
Great, thanks so much, Yifan. We have another question from LD, and she's asking to hear a little bit more on the weather service experience in India and Pakistan. So Elodie's asking, what was the role of PxD versus the weather services providers in this space? And if you have any information on if initial screening or support to help set up a service that is sufficiently good to be self-sustaining then on. Tomoko, do you want to try to take that one on?
Sure, yes. So yeah, I'm just rereading the question. What was the role of PxD versus weather service providers? So what we have done, so when we provide agricultural advisory services, we often have a kind of partnership with the local entities like governments. In the case of Pakistan, it was the government of Punjab, and we have a kind of a process set up to identify agricultural advice and information we provide. So the weather forecast services that we receive from providers like Yifan, we will use, to either just to send out as a kind of weather forecast, kind of extreme weather event alerts or, rainfall probability for the next day. But the agronomists also use the information to kind of modify the advice that we send to farmers as well. So yes, there are two ways of using the information that we receive from providers. One is to just pass the forecasts, directly to farmers, and then second is just using that information internally to improve and kind of optimize the advice that we provide to farmers about, the timing of planting, timing of fertilizer applications, and so on.
Great, thanks. And then following up to that one also, Tomoko, we have a question from Elena who would like to hear about what does it mean to have a high quality weather forecast and who can produce it?
That's a very good question, and I don't know that I have answers to it. I think this has been actually a challenge in general, that there isn't really a standard quality measure for weather forecast across different services. And in that case, again, this is not PxD's expertise, so we've been working with external meteorology experts to assess the quality and looking at the historical data, performance. And we update that, every 6 months, every year, and so forth.
Great, thanks so much, Tomoko. Owen, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of our partnerships. You started off by speaking about how Precision Development's approach to partnerships is really key to how the organization works. Are there some examples of government partnerships or other types of collaboration that have been particularly successful or could maybe serve as an example for other organizations?
I don't know if we I wouldn't want to position us as serving as an example for other organizations, but so one thing to flag up as context is that very often the services that we provide, nearly always, are free to the farmer. And there are a variety of reasons why it's just very difficult for private providers to provide information like weather forecasts, which Tomoko was talking about, and make money doing it. And so we think of a lot of these services as public goods. And at scale and sustainably, public goods are likely to be delivered by governments or other public bodies. And so what we're often doing is thinking about who are the public sector actors who are in the business of supporting the incomes and livelihoods of smallholder farmers and promoting agriculture and growth and increasing productivity. And you know, a really good example has been partnership in Odisha, where we were supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to work with the government of Odisha to do a build, operate and transfer service for providing advice to farmers. And so we worked with the government to set up an advisory service, the technology, the training, the staff, setting up the system, setting up the mechanisms to design the advice, to test the advice and figure out what works. It originally began as a program that was intended to reach 1 million farmers. As it was going, we were asked to increase it to 2 million. And by the time we transferred it to the government of Odisha, it was a little over 3 million, I think. And since we handed it over, the government has continued to operate it. And I think it's now reached over 5 million farmers served. And that build, operate and transfer mechanism, for us, has been a really great partnership because it enabled us, you know, there's an upfront investment, set up time and energy and cost, and a lot of sort of working out what the particular farmers need in that area. And then once it's up and running, it can be run more cheaply in the long term without needing those investment costs. So that partnership is a sort of flagship example. That doesn't mean to say that that would be the only approach that we would adopt. In another case, in Ethiopia, an existing service being run by the Agricultural Transformation Agency, we were invited in to support, to provide technical advice to help them understand how to improve the service, which at the time was suffering from low take-up. And we were able to provide data science and analytics help to develop the product and remove some of the barriers for access for farmers. So there is a sort of government advisory service for an existing system. And in other cases, we've worked with nonprofits, with private sector entities to add a digital dimension, perhaps a digital communication and support and advice to an existing program to help improve its impact cost effectively. It's almost always going to be a partnership with domain expertise, local expertise. And I think a lot of what you know, obviously we bring some technological expertise and some data and analytics and evidence expertise, but also a willingness to really study the situation locally. You know, back to our back to the title of this talk about really centering solutions around the problems of smallholder farmers, really understanding the context. Our teams are local. They go out and try and understand what the obstacles are that smallholder farmers are facing that these services are trying to address, and then help our partners develop products and services that actually address those problems and meet their needs. And I think that product development, designing services that work, using evidence and testing is a really, that's what we bring to the partnership. And you know, as I said, I think on the final slide, our view is that is an approach that can work more widely and is very important. And our goal here is to build the market, not to build our market share.
Great, thanks so much, Owen. We are at time today, so I just wanted to thank again our panelists, Owen, Tomoko, and Yifan, for your commentary, and thank you also to all of our attendees and partners of funders who were able to join us today. So thank you so much, and we'll be following up for some brief feedback and also sharing the recording of this session. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.